Hi, welcome to today's episode of JAMA Network Open Live. I'm Seth Truger, Digital Media Editor for JAMA Network Open.
And I'm Mike Berkowitz. I'm Electronic Editor for JAMA and the JAMA Network, and I'm still filling in for Dr. Fred Rivera from 2 weeks ago.
Right. So if you haven't joined us before, if you've got questions or comments that you want us to address live and you're following along, please either comment in response to the Facebook post. You can tweet us at Twitter at JAMA Network Open, or you can probably comment on the YouTube feed as well if you're on YouTube.
And have your own conversations about the material. Seth, you told me that some of the authors may be actually watching us. So if you're there, hello, and thank you for submitting. And we'll hope to talk about your articles. And please comment and tell us what we get right and what we get wrong.
Right. So first up, we've got an article that's gotten quite a lot of attention so far. It's the association between push-up exercise capacity and future cardiovascular events among active adult men by Justin Yang and colleagues.
Yeah, and Seth, this has been incredibly popular. It's like selling like Tickle Me Elmos before Christmas or something.
Right. We've had over 300,000 views of the article online. The article's page has, what last I checked, was 307,900 views.
And I think that's our all-time winner since the journal started publishing in May. Really popular, a fitness topic. Tell me what the research is.
Right. So these authors did was they looked at a single clinic in Indiana, and I guess an occupational health clinic that did fitness physicals for 10 area Indiana firefighter units, and basically did this push-up capacity test as an assessment of their cardiovascular risk. And so for a period of 7 years, 2000 to 2007, they collected firefighters coming in for their fitness tests, had them do push-ups set to a metronome at 80 hertz, and they had to do the push-ups in time with a metronome, and I think until they missed 3 of them or collapsed, or I guess if their form fell apart, that sort of thing. And then broke them into chunks of 10, so 0 to 10, 11 to 20, et cetera, up to 40 plus, and then correlated that with what kind of cardiovascular events they had in the future, things like onset of heart failure, diagnosis of CAD, or sudden cardiac death.
Got it. And so this is an occupational related cardiovascular disease. This is an occupational exam, presumably for, I don't know, either placement within the force or something like that.
Right.
Okay. And so they dropped and gave them 10, 20, 30, 40, whatever they could do. And I would predict, and I have, the answer is unblinded here, I have seen it, but I would predict that the fewer push-ups you can do, the worse your health is overall.
And that turned out to be true. It's not there.
Ding, ding, ding.
There are times when science does not surprise us. But basically, if you take relatively young, or I guess they call them middle age, but I call them relatively young, healthy men. So an average of 40-year-old firefighters, about 1,100 of them. Followed them for an average of about 8 years each. They had 8,601 person years. And followed them along to see what kind of cardiovascular events they had. Not surprisingly, it's a healthy group. They didn't have a lot. There were only 37 cardiovascular events. But the rates were, not surprisingly, much higher among the firefighters who were less healthy and couldn't do as many push-ups.
Awesome. So this makes me want to kind of turn on the theme from Rocky, because, well, we talk about the kinds of push-ups these were. I don't know whether our audio is picking that up. But I assume these were real push-ups. They're not the Rocky push-ups, which are the one-armed ones with Burgess Meredith watching
clapping.
on. With the clapping in between. And this wasn't the ones from your knees.
Correct.
But there were 2 comments on the site that really took issue, saying that we need to know more about the methods of the push-up assessment. And that really was kind of surprising to me. I never even thought about that before. What do you think about that?
Well, there's a lot you can do. And I was actually talking with Annette about this yesterday, too. Well, first off, this is just a proxy, right? Push-ups aren't, the end-all, be-all predictor of your health. And there's a lot of reasons why certain populations may be better or worse at push-ups. My wife, who's in much better shape than I am, can't really do full regular push-ups. She's a short-statured woman, and she does push-ups on her knees, and still probably does them better than I do. These are 40-year-old male firefighters.
Got it. And so there's other things, though, to kind of pull out of here, and Seth and I had a chance to talk about this. One is that they didn't have that many events. There were only 37 cardiovascular events. And so they needed to divide, the authors needed to divide these push-up into categories. So when you talk about methods for a moment, and your eyes may glaze over, it would be best to kind of analyze these data as continuous data, but you need to kind of divide them into categories. It's not clear necessarily that it's linear. That is, the difference between 9 and 11 push-ups may be a lot less than the difference between, I don't know, 35 and 45 push-ups. I don't know how many you can do. I tried it. I can eke out about 25, so I think I'm kind of okay.
Yeah.
I don't know what my cardiovascular health is. And when the authors ended, it looks like when they did a multivariable regression, that push-ups were no longer statistically significantly independent risk factor for the event. Is that right?
Yeah, so when they adjusted for things like age and BMI and LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, et cetera, it basically pretty much fell out. It didn't totally go, the effect didn't totally go away. I guess the most generous thing I could say is that if you wanted to get a basic cardiovascular assessment without doing any work, without measuring LDLs, without measuring weight, without measuring age, you could get a really good basic assessment. I think there's a little bit of utility here. I think as the news coverage shows with this and the attention this article has gotten online, there's some kind of like face value interest in something like this.
Right.
There's definitely some shots of like local anchorman on the news doing push-ups on TV. Apparently one of them embarrassingly so. I also found there was, of course, some activity on Twitter about this. The best comment I found was, wait, there are firefighters in Indiana who can't do 10 push-ups?
Well, they have the desk jobs. I think they're dispatching the trucks.
Right. And again, you know, I would imagine that probably correlates with some of the other markers of health that we know about, things like BMI, age, perhaps other musculoskeletal injuries that limit push-ups.
Right. So I'm going to say what you said in a different way, which may make it more complicated, but it's just a different way to think about it. There's probably more than one variable at play here. When you adjust for age, and I think when you adjust for BMI and maybe VO2, which is another measure of fitness, push-ups are no longer associated with the outcome. So it may be equally easy to say, well, let me say this a different way. It may be that the people who could only do the lower stratum of push-ups were the firefighters who were older and therefore less physically fit. It may not be that there's additional information you get from push-ups as a fitness measure over and above asking how old somebody is, and you would expect that a 25-year-old firefighter would be more fit than a 45 or a 60-year-old firefighter.
Right, exactly. The strength here isn't that it would add to other information, but just replace more complicated or difficult information. And it's just kind of, honestly, I think it's just a fun study.
Right. It's just compelling and nice to talk about. So check it out on JAMANetworkOpen.com and leave comments here or after the broadcast if you have other things to say about the study.
Yeah, and basically just remember, if you can't do 10 push-ups, you're probably going to have a heart attack tomorrow.
No, we don't want to say that.
Sorry, jokes are not medical advice.
But start any kind of exercise or physical activity is none, is what I tell my patients.
It's better than none.
Right. It's better.
It's not none. It's better than none.
It is better than none. That is correct. Yeah. Always move yourself one step forward.
Exactly. We all misspeak sometimes. It's okay. I'm sure I've done it before.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on to our next paper, a little less fun. But a little more clinical. So the prevalence, underlying causes, and preventability of sepsis-associated mortality in U.S. acute care hospitals by JNO Rhee and colleagues.
Okay, and sepsis is kind of a hot topic for a number of reasons. One, people are living longer, getting more complicated treatments, and therefore getting these overwhelming infections. Two, we need to make inroads in terms of mortality because we need to be able to recognize it earlier to get people prompt treatment, and there's a lot of movement in research and in practice in terms of bundled care. You know this, I know, and you can probably tell me better. And three, there's actually evolution of technologies like RNA signatures that are allowing more precise diagnosis earlier.
Right. I can't tell you much about RNA signatures, though.
Okay, great. But you know it from the ED, and I don't know that there was much emergency medicine within this study, but tell me what it showed.
So basically, they looked at a bunch of patients at 6 U.S. hospitals. It was 3 academic centers. I think it was it Brigham or Mass General?
Yeah, it was Brigham.
It was Brigham and one of their affiliates.
Right.
It was Duke and one of their community affiliates, and Barnes in St. Louis and one of their community affiliates.
Right.
They looked at all the deaths during their time period, so 2014 through 2015, randomly selected 100 of them, and then divided them to sepsis deaths, which is about half of them, and non-sepsis deaths, and basically had a bunch of docs look at it and say, hola.
Yes.
Sorry, that's a message from social media here.
Yeah.
And looked at these and graded them on a 1 to 6 scale of, is it definitely preventable? Was the death absolutely not preventable? Was it possibly preventable or preventable under ideal circumstances with optimal care? And although I would suggest that in these kind of studies, my expectation would be that docs are a little bit biased as far as saying that things probably aren't preventable, because I think we like to think that our colleagues do good work. But looking at the way they assess stuff, it seemed pretty fair.
Yeah, it did seem pretty fair. I guess the question I had is that it seemed like fish in a barrel in a way, in the sense that they took 6 hospitals and they just said that we're going to take 600 deaths and we're going to see which were sepsis and which were not. Don't we have information systems that are national, VA, HCUP, ARC, whatever it is, to look at this in a more generalizable way than just saying, this seemed like a pilot study of some sort, which isn't to diminish the effort, but it seemed like a kind of a very focused effort that may not be generalizable across the country.
Yeah, so I think you're right as far as the breadth that this study could look at was relatively small, because they looked at 600 deaths in 6 hospitals. I think probably the strength here is probably the internal validity, the depth that they were able to go into, where they really looked into each case. If you look at HCUP or NAMCs, any of those kind of things, it's basically census workers with high school levels of education. There's big back and forth years ago on how accurate NAMCs was, because things like what percentage of ectopic pregnancy patients never had positive pregnancy tests, and apparently, from what I'm told, I don't know the details on this, it was the non-medical abstractors just didn't know that like HCG and UCG were pregnancy tests. Some of those things that look like they're signals in the noise there turn out to actually be true. Like there was a big study probably about a decade ago that showed that a bunch of patients who were getting intubated and paralyzed weren't actually getting sedation afterwards. And we're like, oh, this is silly. We can't possibly be doing that. And then when better studies looked at it, it actually was correct. And there were a lot of patients who weren't getting post-intubation sedation. Again, the point is that administrative data sets have big limitations, because when you're getting big, giant, thousands of patients worth of data, it's really hard to get accurate data from it.
And so the benefit of this study, if I understand what you're saying, is it's kind of much more focused, and they actually did medical record review, which is really hard to do at scale at a national level. So they can identify what's going on in fine, granular form at these particular hospitals.
And it was a study authors who are physicians. Most of them have other secondary degrees as well, so they're really looking into these cases and seeing what happened, and probably doing a better job of assigning cause of death than the docs who actually assign cause of death on the death records, which I used to do as an intern on internal medicine or in the ED, and I will tell you, I had minimal training and did a terrible job.
Okay, so I've held you up from kind of telling the viewers what exactly this study says.
So the answer is that basically we did a pretty good job. Of the 300 or so sepsis deaths, they found only, what was it, 36 of them were preventable or probably preventable. On their 6-point scale, it was the top 3 points. And most of them had to do with, not surprisingly, recognition of sepsis, decision to initiate antibiotics, and the appropriate antibiotics. Some of them were things where it was things like, a patient had, I think it was E. coli pneumonia, and they didn't have gram-negative coverage. Some of them are source control, things like patients who should have had empyema drained, or a gangrenous gallbladder taken out, or small bowel obstruction with necrotic bowel that wasn't recognized. Some of them were, kind of things that made me grimace a little bit, like patients with cancer and fever and didn't get any antibiotics in the hospital, the kind of stuff that is pretty rote now.
Right. So to kind of put a frame around this, these are adults, and they tend to be older adults, so that's to whom these results apply. So younger age groups these older adults, this population, had a lot of chronic comorbidities, particularly solid cancers, heart failure. They're the kinds of things you expect to see in octo and nonogenarians. Actually, they were a younger crowd too, but this was kind of generally a geriatric set. And in the geriatric set, what they're saying is that a lot of these patients have overwhelming infection, that is sepsis, on top of existing chronic illness. That's not particularly surprising, and that it's a minority of those cases then where you can actually prevent the sepsis, the sepsis-related mortality. It reminds me of that old saying from Osler. He's been said to have said that pneumonia is the old man's friend. He actually apparently didn't say that. I think he said that pneumonia is the natural end of the old man, or of older people. But in some sense, pneumonia leads in the pre-antibiotic era to overwhelming sepsis, and this is kind of what Osler was talking about. When you get old and when you get sick, it's much more likely that sepsis is going to take your life, and eventually there's only so much doctors in the health system can do.
Exactly. I mean, the bottom line is we don't live forever, and eventually we're all going to die, and a lot of that's going to be from infection. In this study, it was about half of the patients who died in the hospital were from infection, and only a very small fraction, only about, I think it was 5% essentially, were really obviously preventable.
And almost always the bugs win in the end, It doesn't apply to kids, doesn't apply to middle-aged folks. We still want to really get sepsis protocols in place and improve our diagnostics. But in older folks, we still want to treat them quickly too. Only so much we can do.
Right. Yep, exactly. And again, as you said, just to reinforce, Figure 1 really shows just the distribution of what the causes of death were. And these patients had really serious end organ damage, things like strokes, chronic renal disease, chronic liver disease, chronic pulmonary disease, chronic heart disease. 20-something% had solid cancers, as you said. A bunch had blood cancers. These were sick patients who had fatal diseases.
And I'll match your figure and raise you one table too, because I found that really interesting. It puts kind of a human or clinical touch on it, where they give narrative descriptions of the types of patients who came in who had definitely or moderately likely preventable sepsis, potentially preventable and unlikely to be preventable. That really grounded it for me in the clinical work we're all doing.
Yep, that was really interesting for me to read. Unfortunately, all those words in that small text didn't work well for a frame to Eric to make for us to put on screen, so I didn't want to put that one on.
So you have to visit our website and read the article for yourselves.
Right.
Thanks.
And remember, it's free.
It's free and open access. You can do what you want with it. It's Creative Commons license.
Okay. And last paper we've got today, another opioid paper, Use of Prescription Opioids and Initiation of Fatal Two-Vehicle Crashes by Stanford, Chahuri, and Guaha Lee. I'm very sorry about my pronunciations there.
Great, no problem. I mean, no skin off my no skin off my back. So they're using a national database to see where there's two-vehicle crashes, where there's at least one fatality, and then looking to see if opioids were involved.
Yep, and what was really interesting here, as opposed to a lot of the data we have on kind of substance use in crashes, is they did two-vehicle crashes, so they had pairs of drivers to compare. So they could say, there's a driver, this one went into the other lane, therefore they're the one who initiated the crash. Was this person more likely to have opioids or alcohol involved than the person who was also driving, who got hit by the initiator? And not surprisingly, they found the answer is yes.
Yes, but not as clear. Yes, but not as clearly. I mean, so opioids were associated with an increased risk of mortality, right? From a crash, or with increased risk of a crash itself?
Well, I think these were all fatal crashes. I think everybody was dead in this study.
Okay. So drivers culpable of initiating the crashes were more likely to test positive for prescription opioids, is the result.
But the rates weren't that impressive. It was about 5% versus 3%. That being said, if you look at the graph that Eric's going to pull up for us, Figure 2, you can see that as the opioid epidemic has become endemic, the numbers have gone up quite a bit from basically the 1% to 2% range to now it's this like 5 to 7% range. So 5% of people who didn't do anything wrong, as far as we could tell from administrative data in these crashes, still had opioids on board, and 7% of the people who we think initiated the crashes, based on police reports, the other kind of stuff that gets into these big NHTSA databases, 7% did have opioids on board. And there was a bit of a synergy between opioids and alcohol, which is not surprising that if you are drinking alcohol and you're taking opioids, you're likely to do something like weave into the other lane.
So tell me about that synergy, because I thought there was no statistically significant interaction. So that's kind of statistical speak, but I thought there was no effect modification of opioids on alcohol or conversely. Did you read otherwise?
No, you probably read this better than I did. The adjusted...
Okay.
No.
Well, so
yeah, you're right. No interaction.
Okay. So no interaction. The other thing is in Table 3, if you look, that's the results of their multivariable analysis, and you'll see an adjusted odds ratio of 8.2 for blood alcohol. So that's, if you like this kind of narrative language, 8 times the risk, whereas the risk for opioids is 2.18 or 2.2. So really the risk still is around alcohol, much more than opioids, but not surprisingly, opioids are now in the mix in these car crashes as they become more prevalent. The risk is also quite a bit high for people who are over age 65. That's 1.98, and that's statistically equivalent to the risk for opioids. So I'm not saying those are interchangeable. But really, we had, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I was thinking of the acronym for Mothers Against Opioid Driving. I don't know that there's a good one for that. Yes, something like that. So we probably want that movement, but it is not, at least if these data are to be believed, it's not as significant a contributor as blood, as alcohol is still at this point.
So 3 things. First off, thank you to Liz Salmi for chiming in, who said brilliant to host this livecast during lunchtime for the West Coast. Glad we could do it. It's hard to find a time that's good for all the different time zones.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks. And thanks for chiming in. We love the comments. Also, for me, one of the most interesting parts here was when they were trying to figure out why the crash was initiated, what kind of mistakes the drivers were making. It was the most common was failure to keep in lane was 40%.
Right, yeah.
Failure to yield right away, so 25%. So basically either they didn't recognize the other driver was there or didn't care that the other driver was there when they should have. And speeding, which was 17%, which honestly the speeding seemed a bit low to me.
Right.
But again, that's good. And probably the best news I can take from this, I'm not always a cynic, the good news here is that the alcohol use rate has actually gone down a lot in these drivers. So of the people who died in fatal car crashes in this time period from 1993 to 2016, used to test, in 1993, 34% tested positive for alcohol, and it's down to 28% in 2016. So that's a pretty decent increase. So those Mothers Against Drunk Driving are, doing a bit of a good job.
Right. Great. There's a couple other things I want to mention here. First off, this is a feature article in the new JAMA Network Open Editors Summary podcast. Fred Rivera and Deputy Editor Steve Finn are summarizing 2 articles from each monthly release. So that's featured, and you can subscribe or listen to that podcast on wherever you get your podcast. It's now on iTunes. It's on Spotify. It should be on Google Play and iHeartRadio, and soon we'll be able to give you a website address where you can just subscribe under jamanetwork.com. But the reason I'm mentioning that is because they discussed it, and Fred pointed out a couple things. One is he thought that the prevalence of a lane change initiating the crash suggested a different mechanism of effect, which isn't particularly surprising, but Fred thought that it's suggesting that opioids are not changing judgment, but are basically sedatives. They're decreasing alertness. That's how he interpreted the data. I wasn't quite so convinced, but there may be a different mechanism of effect with or without alcohol on board. Right. He also pointed out that the reason we can do this study and the reason our roads are safer is because there is this fatal accident road safety database, and he drew a parallel, if we may do that, with firearms. We don't have a national database that looks at fatalities and is a reliable source of information that allows us to say, how can we be safer with our firearms the way we are with our cars, and they can be equally fatal.
Yep, absolutely. And Fred's got some very serious public health chops. He can talk about this stuff much more intelligently than I can.
Right.
Some great comments. JD Lucky was also surprised that there's not a synergistic effect with the drugs and alcohol.
Right.
Or thought there would have been. And Min says he's hot. He's live with us watching as well.
Hey, Min. Min's in Australia, I think. So that's the extent of the reach of JAMA Network Open. And, we can follow up maybe next week on this synergistic or interaction effect if we find that we've misunderstood it. But, again, an effect modification or a statistical interaction is very dependent on the data. We don't have access to the data. It's important to say, but there might be other things going on. Right. And every one of these research articles doesn't establish truth. It establishes a probable truth, and it's kind of a picture element as we kind of build a general image of evidence that's in support of one policy or another, or one clinical practice or another. So if you don't believe it, you can always do the research and try and prove something else, and we got to keep looking at this data to understand whether opioids are making their way into traffic fatalities.
Right. And remember, these are for two cars, so 2 separate driver fatal crashes. If I remember correctly, about 2/3 of motor vehicle deaths are single drivers, mostly driving drunk, driving off the road or into a tree or something like that.
Right.
So this is, not necessarily extrapolatable to everything else we know.
Right, and they excluded those single vehicle crashes and also multi-vehicle crashes and also heavy vehicles and commercial vehicles. Right. So these are, you and me driving to work, for example.
It's basically, because they wanted to have the paired data where they could compare the driver who initiated versus the driver who didn't, you got to make some sacrifices. It's the classic battle of internal versus external validity.
Right. And I think maybe the takeaway is what Click and Clack say is don't drive like my brother or don't drive like him. And
also, don't do drugs and drive.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And don't drive around other people who are doing drugs and driving.
Right. And wear your seatbelt.
Right. All important stuff.
Click it or ticket.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Thanks for the comments, for those who chimed in. Join us again next week. We'll be back. I believe we'll be back to Monday next week.
I think so.
We'll post some times when we get that finalized.
Right.
Thanks for joining us. Feel free to send more comments into us. Follow us on social channels, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at JAMA Network Open.
And we will post links to these articles after we get off the air so that you can click through directly. And you can always sign up for emails. And as I said, if you at least listen to the Editor Summary podcast and subscribe to.
Yep, absolutely. And of course, read these articles and more for free at JAMANetworkOpen.com.
And tune in 10 a.m. on Friday, Greenwich Mean Time -6, for the newest articles coming up.
Great.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for commenting, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good week.
Take care.